It is the late summer of 1944, and somewhere in the dust-choked interior of France, a column of Sherman tanks rolls forward under a pale sky. The ground trembles. Petrol fumes hang in the August air. This is the domain of General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the United States Third Army, and in this particular theatre of the Second World War, his word is very nearly law. The men under his command know this. The officers under his command know this. And yet, on a day that would become one of the more remarkable footnotes of the entire campaign, one white officer, a man in a position of authority, a man who should have understood the stakes, chose to break the rules. What he did was not spectacular in the way of battlefield heroism. He did not disobey a tactical order. He did not surrender. He did not flee. He did not betray his comrades to the enemy. What he did was something both smaller and, in the context of the United States Army in 1944, considerably more charged. He attempted to pull rank over black soldiers who were ahead of him in a queue. He ordered them out of the way on the basis of their race. He expected, as so many officers in that segregated army expected, that the colour of his skin and the bars on his shoulder would simply carry the matter. What he did not expect was George Patton. This moment, small in duration, enormous in implication, cuts to the heart of something historians have long wrestled with when it comes to America's most flamboyant and controversial general. Patton was a man of breathtaking contradictions. He was a product of the old American South, steeped in the racial attitudes of his class and his era. He used language that would make a modern reader flinch. He held views about race that were, by any honest assessment, deeply compromised. And yet, in this particular moment, in this particular place, he did something that nobody in that army expected. He stood up for the black soldiers. He disciplined the white officer. He enforced the rules as the rules were written, regardless of the colour of the men involved. Why? How? And what does it tell us about the man, the army, and the country that sent them both to war? To understand what Patton did, one must first understand the world he was operating in. The United States Army that fought in the Second World War was a rigidly segregated institution. This was not incidental, not a matter of administrative oversight or regional preference. It was policy. It was law. The military had been organised along racial lines since the aftermath of the American Civil War. And by 1944, that organisation had calcified into something almost geological in its solidity. Black soldiers were assigned to separate units, separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate everything. They were commanded, in almost every case, by white officers. They were given older equipment, fewer promotions, and consistently lesser assignments than their white counterparts. The Army's official position was that this arrangement reflected practical necessity. Segregationists argued, with the peculiar confidence of people who have never subjected their assumptions to scrutiny, that black soldiers were less capable, less reliable, less suited to combat leadership. The historical record contradicts this entirely, but the historical record was not setting policy in Washington in 1944. Politicians were, generals were, men who had absorbed the racial cosmology of the Jim Crow South were. What this created, on a practical level, was an atmosphere in which certain behaviours were implicitly sanctioned. White soldiers, and especially white officers, understood that they occupied a different tier of the institutional hierarchy. Not just a different rank, but a different category of person. The assumption that a white officer could displace black enlisted men from a queue, from a seat, from any position of relative comfort or convenience was not considered a violation of military discipline. It was considered, in many quarters, simply the natural order of things. But the United States Army had, under enormous political pressure, and partly through the advocacy of black leaders and journalists, also issued regulations that theoretically prohibited racial discrimination in access to facilities, transport, and services. Executive Order 8802, signed by President Roosevelt in 1941, had at least nominally banned discriminatory hiring in defense industries. The Army's own regulations, however reluctantly drafted and however inconsistently enforced, were on the books. The rules on paper said one thing, the culture in practice said another. This was the contradiction that the white officer stumbled into, and this was the contradiction that Patton, with his unique and ferocious brand of military authority, chose, in this instance, to resolve. The specific account most frequently cited in this context comes from the testimony of men who served in black units under Patton's Third Army, and from the general's own documented behaviour towards black soldiers during the campaign across France. The incident involving the Q, the white officer who attempted to push black soldiers aside, was witnessed by multiple men and recounted in the years and decades following the war. The details vary slightly depending on the source, as eyewitness accounts invariably do, but the core of it is consistent. Patton arrived. Patton saw what was happening. Patton did not look away. What he said to the white officer has been rendered in various forms, but the substance is the same in every telling. He told the man, in the clearest possible terms, that the army had rules, that those rules applied to every soldier, regardless of his complexion, that the black soldiers in that queue had as much right to be there as any white man, and that if the officer felt otherwise, he was welcome to test that feeling against the considerable weight of military discipline. Patton was not, in this moment, making a speech about racial equality. He was not delivering a philosophical lecture. He was a military commander enforcing what he understood to be the proper functioning of his army. The distinction matters because it explains both the power of the act and its limits. Patton was not an abolitionist. He was not a civil rights pioneer. He was a man who believed, with almost religious intensity, in military order, military effectiveness, and military discipline. When he saw those things threatened, even by a white officer, even by the racial attitudes that permeated his entire world, he reacted the way he always reacted to threats against order. He crushed them. The officers and men who witnessed this did not all interpret it the same way. Some of the black soldiers present remembered it as a moment of genuine shock, that a general of Patton's stature and reputation had publicly defended them against a white officer. Some recalled it as proof that, whatever Patton's other failings, he treated combat soldiers as combat soldiers. Some were more sceptical, understanding that one intervention, however dramatic, did not constitute a transformation of the institutional racism that surrounded them. They were not wrong to be sceptical. The army remained segregated. The inequality of assignment, equipment, and opportunity continued. Patton himself, in other documented moments, expressed views about race that were reactionary, even by the standards of his day. He was not a converted man. He was a complicated one. If you are finding this history as layered as it appears, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. To compare Patton's behaviour here with that of his contemporaries in the American officer class is to encounter the full spectrum of what the army tolerated and what it did not. Many senior commanders in the European theatre made no effort whatsoever to enforce even the nominal regulations against racial discrimination. The behaviour exhibited by that white officer in Patton's army was not unusual. In many commands, it was essentially invisible, a transaction so routine that nobody thought to record it, challenge it, or acknowledge it as a violation of anything at all. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, was more cautious on these questions. He was politically minded in a way Patton never was, and he was acutely conscious of the pressures from black leaders, from the press, from the Roosevelt administration, to at least maintain the appearance of fair treatment. But Eisenhower's caution produced a kind of administrative neutrality rather than active enforcement. He was unlikely to ignore a flagrant public violation of the sort Patton witnessed. He was equally unlikely to go looking for such violations, or to make an example of a junior officer who had simply done what junior officers in the American South had been doing all their lives. What distinguished Patton, in this context, was not liberal sentiment. It was his absolute, almost messianic belief in the effectiveness of his army. Black soldiers of the Third Army, many of them in support and logistics roles, some in combat, were, to Patton's view, his soldiers. They were his responsibility. Their performance was a reflection on him. Any officer who undermined their readiness, their morale, or their ability to function was, in Patton's personal cosmology, undermining him. The racial transgression and the military transgression were, in his mind, inseparable. This is a very different moral framework from the one that civil rights activists were simultaneously constructing. It reaches the same conclusion: the officer was wrong, the black soldiers were right. By an entirely different route. One arrives there through the universality of human dignity. The other arrives there through the logic of military efficiency. The destination overlaps. The journey does not. The German military, for what it is worth, did not face analogous questions in quite the same form. The Wehrmacht was racist in its ideology in ways that far exceeded anything in the American army. But the black soldiers were not a feature of its own ranks that it had to manage. The comparison that matters more is with the British Army, which had its own complicated relationship with questions of race, empire, and the soldiers it drew from across the Commonwealth. The British, broadly speaking, were less institutionally segregated by skin colour in their own military units, though their relationship with soldiers from Africa, India, and the Caribbean was shot through with the condescensions of empire. The Americans, paradoxically, had a more formally codified and legally enforced system of racial separation, despite their nation's founding principles about equality. The actual historical impact of this incident, and others like it, is genuinely difficult to assess. It did not change army policy, it did not end segregation. The men who witnessed it went back to their units and continued serving in a military apparatus that treated them as second-class soldiers, in 100 ways that no single general's intervention could address. The inequality of assignment, of recognition, of posthumous honour, continued throughout the war and long after it. And yet the accounts of these moments, Patton dressing down a white officer, Patton shaking the hands of black soldiers, Patton speaking to his men of all colours, in the same register of fierce martial demand, were else preserved. They were passed down. They were cited in the memoirs and testimonies of veterans for whom the war was already framed as a double struggle, against fascism abroad, against discrimination at home. The memory of a general who, whatever his private failings, had in at least some public moments enforced the rules as written, carried a certain weight. It was not redemptive, but it was real. The psychological impact on the officer in question, and on officers who heard about such incidents, is perhaps more quantifiable in its immediate effects. The United States Army ran on hierarchy and on the fear of consequences. When a general of Patton's standing made clear that racial harassment of his soldiers would not be tolerated within his sight, it sent a message through the informal networks of the officer class in a way that a written regulation never quite could. Not because Patton was morally exemplary, but because Patton was terrifying. His displeasure was an event. His approval was worth having. His correction of your behaviour in front of witnesses was something you did not forget. The black soldiers of the Third Army knew this. Some of them in later years spoke of Patton with a complicated respect that they themselves found difficult to fully articulate. He was not their advocate in any meaningful political sense. He did not fight for their rights. He did not use his considerable influence to argue, in Washington or anywhere else, for the desegregation of the military that President Truman would eventually order in 1948. But within the bounded world of his army, in the specific theatre of a specific campaign, he had, on at least some occasions, treated them as soldiers. Not as a category, not as a problem. As soldiers, that may seem like an extraordinarily low bar. Given the context, it was not. Return to that column of tanks in the French summer. The dust settling. The queue forming. The white officer, confident in assumptions that his entire society had affirmed his entire life, moving to assert a privilege so normalised he barely registered it as a choice. And then Patton, approaching in the way that Patton always approached things. With velocity, with volume, with absolute certainty that whatever he was about to do was the correct thing to do. What happened next was not a revolution. It was not a turning point in the history of American race relations. It did not echo through the halls of Congress or alter the calculations of the men who designed the segregated system. It was one moment, in one place, involving one officer who learned briefly and sharply that the rules applied to him. But history is built from such moments. The great transformation, the ones that eventually do echo through Congress, that do alter systems, that do change the experience of millions of people, are rarely born solely from legislation or court decisions or executive orders. They are also built, piece by painstaking piece, from every moment in which someone in authority looked at an injustice and said, "Not here, not today, not on my watch." Patton did not say those words for the reasons we might wish he had. He said them because he was Patton, and because within the particular logic of his particular mind, allowing a white officer to push around his soldiers was a violation of order, and violations of order were intolerable. The reasoning was self-serving in a sense. The army he cared about was, instrumentally, the army that won his battles. Its efficiency was his glory. And yet, The black soldiers standing in that queue were standing in that queue. The white officer received his correction. The rules, for a moment, applied equally. History is not always made by the pure of heart. It is sometimes made by the complicated ones, acting, for whatever reason, in ways that happen to align with something we can later recognise as right. Patton was not a good man in any simple or uncomplicated sense. He was brilliant and brutal, and bigoted and brave. He was a contradiction walking around in jodhpurs and pearl-handled revolvers, bellowing at the sky. But on that afternoon, in that dust, he looked at what was happening and chose, for reasons entirely his own, to stop it. That is the answer to the question. That is how Patton handled a white officer who broke the rules. He handled him the way he handled everything else that stood in the way of his army working, as he believed an army should work. He demolished him, and then he moved on. The war did not pause, the dust resettled, the column kept rolling, but the soldiers who saw it did not forget. And neither now should we.